BBC London 94.9.
Vanessa Feltz.
Call 020 722 42000.
So, just before we went to the travel, I said to Jonathan Davis, you're saving. You can't afford a property. It's beyond your wildest dreams. You're saving. And George Osborne says, this morning, this is great, from April the 1st of this year, all you need is 5% of the value of the property that you want to buy. I will lend you 20% tax-free. Isn't that fantastic, I asked, disingenuously, because I know that he's going to say no. And he says, well, it's all right in the short term, but, and now he's going to tell us what's wrong with it. What is wrong with it?
The media doesn't focus enough on how much this country is in the economic mire. Let me give you their listeners some numbers. The government takes in about 600 billion of tax revenues every year. It spends 720 billion. It has debts on its balance sheet of 1,100 billion. And off the balance sheet, in other words, debts it doesn't even admit to, it's got another 4,000 billion. Now, let's put those numbers into those that we can all relate to. A household takes in 60,000 income, spends 72,000, has 110,000 on the plastic, and has a mortgage of 400,000. Vanessa, you and I both know that that household is bankrupt. This country is bankrupt. And what we're doing is the government is doing is borrowing another £120 billion a year.
All right, I'm going to say something you're not going to like, but let me say it anyway, because I think I'm a real person, and I think I react like quite a lot of other people react to these things. If I'm wrong, lovely listener, you ring in and tell me on 0207 224 2000. As far as I'm concerned, what you're saying, I'm sure, is true. I can't possibly argue with you. However, it feels fairly notional. It feels monopoly money. It feels outside real life. But what does feel real to me is actual people, human beings who used to have the means to, in a previous generation, or even as little as 20 years ago or 10 years ago, might have had the means to buy their own property and launch themselves on their own life, but haven't. And the idea of this kind of inestimable debt that we can't even quantify, that grows and grows exponentially every hour that we breathe, is one thing. But these real concrete people, call them Joe and Josephine, being helped to buy a flat somewhere near, High Barnet because of George Osborne, isn't that in every way a plus? Because once they've bought the flat, then they'll buy carpets, then the carpet man's happy, they'll buy curtains, the curtain lady's happy, then they'll have, they'll have children. It isn't that the way of facilitating the kind of happiness and equilibrium of the next generation?
If only that were true. The fact is, this country has had no economic growth for 6 years. And while they continue in this borrowing, and buying votes, short-termist way of so-called managing the economy, what's going to happen is that we're not going to have any growth in the country for another 26 years. One side of the political divide says we need growth. Another side of the political divide says we're trying to get growth. Listen, you cannot get growth when you're mired under so much debt. And
but how does it help matters? But how does it help matters to have Joe and Josephine renting somewhere rather than buying somewhere? Why does that? Why? So isn't this better?
No.
Why not?
Because in due course, does anyone seriously believe that the amount of debt across the world, the low economic activity across the world, does anyone seriously believe that we're going to get economic growth globally? No, we're not. In fact, China is practically in recession. The EU is in depression. The US is fragile on the point of recession. The UK, 0.6% growth. Believe me, that doesn't even come close to being what we need. 80% of the planet is bordering or in recession. The next time we have a visible recession, do you know what the government and the Bank of England cannot do? They cannot slash interest rates, which is what they've done for the last 40 years to get them out of their own mistakes. So
hang on a second. So what would you have had George Osborne do in terms, let's only restrict it to the housing situation? Would you have had him leave Joe and Josephine saving, probably saving for another 30 years and never having a chance to buy their own place? Would that have been better?
No, certainly not, and it wouldn't have resulted in that. And that is the myth that the media puts out all the time. successive governments have been propping up the house prices, not the housing market. Ask any estate agent who's doing half the business he was doing 5 years ago. And remember, 20, 30 years ago that you talk about, you could buy a house because it was affordable. It's not affordable any longer. So instead of propping up house prices, do you know what the solution would be? Let the prices fall.
But how do they do that? Because haven't we got loads and loads of foreign money pumping into London? Isn't Boris Johnson always talking about how we're this fantastic investment centre, world global finance capital? So we've got American money and Chinese money and Russian money and all sorts of people coming and buying enormously expensive properties here, haven't we?
Yeah, what's that got to do with John and Jean Smith, who were just talking about?
Well, that the property prices are kept inflated by the constant influx of money and very wealthy people being prepared to pay the prices. Yeah, that's keeping Bishop's Avenue and Kensington Park Gardens at £50 million. We're not talking about Mr. and Mrs. Average here. OK, let's bring in a caller. Let's bring Andrew on the line in Shoreditch on. Hello, Andrew. You're on to me and you're on to Jonathan Davis. Morning.
Good morning, Vanessa.
Go on, talk.
OK, well, I think it's the money supply that's put us in this mess. George Osborne giving more money to people to put themselves into debt and afford overinflated house prices that have been fueled by the free money or cheap money is just making it worse.
Do you think so, Jonathan?
He's absolutely correct, and that's exactly the point. If you asked the question, how do we bring down house prices? Will we stop policies which prop up house prices, whether it's stamp duty reduction or help for first-time buyers and so on, then the demand would fall and the prices would be forced to fall.
Except that people have been saying that for years in London and it hasn't happened. They kept on saying that.
Because they've been propping up the prices with successive policies.
But you said earlier that they weren't much good. You described them as peripheral. You didn't say they were pivotal, centrifugal policies. You said they were fairly irrelevant policies.
I did, and it is absolutely the fact that they said that all those other policies were going to prop up the market stayed collapsed. They said it was going to prop up prices around the country. Prices have been falling, indeed collapsing. In London, because we have the economy that we have, and as you say, because of the foreigners buying the £20 million houses, that's kept the average prices up. But if they stopped all the policies to prop up prices, I tell you, more people would sell their properties, the prices would fall, and then John and Jean Smith, your listeners, would actually have a cost of living which is reasonable, as opposed to it being sucked out of them month after month.
OK, this is from Marcel in Camden Town, who says, thanks very much to Andrew in Shoreditch, by the way, who says, I hope your expert can answer this question. I live in a shared ownership property with my partner and we own 60% of our property. Assuming we pass the affordability test, will we be able to use the new government scheme to staircase out, i.e. buy the outstanding share of our property so we can own 100%? Hope you can let me know.
My understanding is, I haven't looked at it in the detail that you're asking, my understanding is that if you have a 5% deposit, then you're entitled to take advantage of this initiative. So if you've got 5% deposit, I think that's your answer. OK, let's bring in Andrew on the line in Docklands. Hi, Andrew. Morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Yes, I think the biggest stimulus that the government is doing to the housing market is, of course, the interest rates. You know, if you imagine if interest rates went up a couple of percent, 3%, and actually gave savers some money, that would be the point. But my real question is, you know, they're talking George Osborne giving away these interest-free loans to first-time buyers, but they're not. And they're not free loans. They're going to be paid for by our grandchildren. When these people finally have a housing collapse, which is going to happen, then it's going to be our grandchildren that's going to be paying.
Let me bring Jonathan Davis in on this, because I should tell you that what you've said is pretty much exactly what he said to me before the programme started. So this is his chance to say it on air. Here you go.
And sir, it's not our grandchildren who'll be paying for all this, for trying to get the present government re-elected. It'll be our children. My children are under 10, and by the time they get to adulthood, we will be, as a country, spending so much just on interest on the debt that you can say goodbye to the welfare state. You can say massive reductions in spending on health, on education, defence, police, you name it. Already, the government is spending £50 billion a year out of 720 just on interest. You think the austerity is because of particularly this government's policies? No, the austerity is because of decades of rising government debt, where politicians promised the people more for less cost. What they didn't tell them is that the extra cost would be taken up by borrowing. Well, do you know what? The chickens are now coming home to roost. That's why we've got austerity. And you think we've got austerity now? You have no idea what's coming down the pike, because we're not going to have the money to fund the public services.
Oh, God, you're terrifying everybody. Andrew, are you terrified, or did you already know all this stuff?
Well, no, I already know all this stuff, and I'm prepared for it. And to think Jonathan's slip of the tongue pike there is about right. We're all going to be pikeys by the end of this, living in the workhouse.
Don't think we're allowed to use that word because it's an obnoxious word, but nevertheless, thanks for calling. So here's the question. Obviously, you don't agree with George Osborne's help for buyers, not even just first-time buyers, but buyers who want to move along or up the property ladder. But is there a possibility that we might end up with this Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae situation, whereby people who can't afford it have been helped to buy properties that they can't afford to maintain, the properties lose their value or interest rates go up, and suddenly you get a mass, exodus of people having to just hand the key back in and all that kind of stuff? Is that a possibility in London?
And that is why I call this the Bill Clinton budget, because that's exactly what they did in America in the 1990s. They made property ownership available to anyone. But think about what ownership means. It means you've got a massive debt. It's not ownership. It's a myth. Eventually, the Fannie Mae organisation was lending money to people who could not service the debt. That's how ridiculous it got. Why were they doing that? Because they were told by the politicians, keep on lending, whatever the price of houses, lend to anyone who wants to borrow. Forget what's going to happen in the future. Forget that house prices can fall as well as rise. And of course, when eventually house prices in America fell 50, 60, 70%, then of course it created the collapse, in fact, not just of American economy, but the world economy. So you ask, can it happen in London? Of course it can happen in London. In order to keep the prices high, they're going to have to continue to prop it up with policy after policy. They're going to have to continue to borrow from our children. And eventually the assumption, there's two assumptions in there. One, that there's not going to be a global economic collapse. Well, I tell you, there is going to be one. And secondly, that interest rates will not rise. Well, I'll tell you, as a direct result of the policies in the budget and the next budget, we're going to be downgraded as a country again. We've been downgraded from AAA to AA.
I'm running out of time, but I need you to give a one-word answer to, well, two questions actually. The first is this. If you're one of the people who could take advantage of this, because you haven't got enough money for the full deposit, but you have got some money, you've got 5%, just a yes or no answer, should you take advantage of it?
No, go out the M25 and rent a property.
Okay. And last question, because we're going to be talking about Twitter and the 7th anniversary since it was created. Do you use it?
I'm an avid Twitterer. I love Twitter.
Why?
Oh, gosh, because I can be my own publisher. I can say whatever I think and feel. I can tell the roughly 1,500 people who follow me about economics and markets. I'm an economist and wealth manager. And about 5% of what I tweet, I tweet about funnies, but 95% is all hard economics, and I think it's an absolute brilliant way to get a message across.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan Davis. If anyone wants to follow you on Twitter, what should they do?
It's Jonathan Davis WM.
Thank you very much for talking to us.